and welcome to episode number 7 of the OBRY Hours. I'm John Mactimus. That is me. That is my real name. Mactimus, from the German, which for a long time we got that sort of right, believing it came from mocked. But it actually comes from OBRY, from mictum. And you'll find mictum in Strong's, entry H4387. David used it on a number of his psalms. You'll find it in most English translations. They won't even translate it, they transliterate it. A mictum of David. Mictum comes from the root katam. Now, katam is not really well translated because in one occurrence, H3799, it's translated as marked. A lot of things are translated as marked. And in H3800, it's translated 9 times as find gold, golden wedge, pure gold. That's not correct. It actually comes from the root tam. Tam, TM, and I am moving around a lot. As I'll do these, I don't think the material I'm going over is going to fit, even in one episode, even given the fact that my episodes are a few hours long. Because there's a lot to it, and it's not all going to be about my name. But I am going to tell you who I am, where I come from, what I understand, about the language we use today, the language that we used centuries ago, which was a middle language that was corrupted from the language that we once used, and the language we once used, OBRY. So, Tam shows up in Strong's a few different times. Now, you gotta understand something about Strong's, and this is going to be very important to everything I'm going to discuss. Strong's, if you pay attention to Strong's, and one easy way to do it is if you have eSword. What you can do with eSword, if you pick the Hebrew Old Testament Plus module in Bibles, and you really should have that. Now, the Hebrew Old Testament Plus is based on the translation that Ginsburg, a Jew, did. It was the Masoretic-critical, and he actually wrote a few books about putting together the Masoretic-critical, okay? Now, I'm not saying that that's the best translation, all right? But I am saying that there's a lot of information on that translation, why he translated it the way he did. Of course, there's also Textus Receptus that was published a couple of centuries prior. And I'm trying to remember if it was Jacob. I want to say it was Haim. I'm sorry, his last name slips. Anyways, that's another module you can get as well. So the Hebrew Old Testament Plus is going to have some variations to, like King James English, where verses are, whether they're there or not. But it's extremely helpful to have, okay? The way that you can test these is that you say there's basically three entries, one official entry in Strong's for tem, okay? Because tem is the root of mictum, okay? The official entry for tem is H8552, and it occurs about 64 times. It occurs in forms like tam, tm, yitem, ytm, tatam, ttm, ettam, etm, tamam, tmm. If you take any one of these entries and you take your eSword module, you bring up the Hebrew Old Testament, you'll notice there are numbers to the left of every single word. So you take any given word and you right-click on it. When you right-click, you go to Quick Search, and then you go to the right, and you can pick either entire Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, or the book you're in. So select Old Testament, and the numbers will be highlighted to the left of the word that you're targeting. And you can look at the variations of the words. Those are very important. The reason they're important is because just about anyone who can speak and read a bit of just plain English, they know that there's a difference between the word dig and dog. They know there's a difference between the words tick and tit. You see, you change one letter, and there's sometimes a vast difference in what the word is. However, so I have charted 3 occurrences of tem. Finish and consume is one, integrity, upright, blameless is another, and then blameless, peaceful, upright. And a lot of it basically means complete. When you look at the glyphs and how they work together, it would mean not the same as oshu, like done. Worked at a lot. Sufficient. Okay? You get katam in there, and it can be alluding to something that is as a perfect thing, or a very something that's been worked over quite a lot. If we're talking about anything, anybody out there who's a musician or craftsman or something, they know the kind of time, the labor, and the passion that goes into a fine work. Okay, that's what katem should actually be. And you put an M in front of that, and you get essentially an instance of a concept. The katem is the concept. The mictum is the instance of the concept. So when David is saying that he is writing a mictum in Psalm 16, Psalm 56, Psalm 57, Psalm 58, Psalm 59, Psalm 60, he is saying that it is a laborious and exquisite work. Now, the es at the end is because German, as well as other languages that originated in OBRY and have been altered over time, it has been blended quite a bit with what we call Greek. You can see it even in the alphabet and how German pronounces its letters and some of the letters that are present and the way that they are pronounced. You will see oftentimes these so-called Greek Helen endings. OS, it's simply a feminine suffix. There's feminine and masculine suffix. And what I may get into as we go, it's likely, is the way that suffixes that are deemed feminine or masculine work. They don't necessarily mean feminine in the sense of specifically a woman or female. More oftentimes, it is simply denoting something that is like, but not quite, or something that is not complete. Greek suffixes don't work exactly the same as OBRY suffixes or other suffixes, but most older languages, the prefixes and the suffixes oftentimes work in strangely similar ways. And you have to remember something else. What they call Koine Greek is very different than what they call classical Greek. And there's a number of different forms of Greek. I don't know why, but it could likely be because what we call Greek was the language spoken by a very large number of people in the area of Europe, or more likely the area of Asia, and what we call Latin was more likely the language that was spoken in various forms by the various people types in Europe. It's possible that Greek was, what we call Greek, was more Eastern, and what we call Latin was more Western. Anyways, that was just a start to let you know who I am, and that I know who I am. There are only a few language types that you're going to find in Europe. You're basically going to find, in Western Europe, you're basically going to find Greek language types, Latin language types, and OBRY language types, as far as what their etymologies are. Or you can go and believe the people who have written the etymology dictionaries and term things as, for instance, Proto-Indo-European, and make up all kinds of stories, as they do with our history and as they do with science and literature, et al. So, just to get that straight, I'm not hiding. This is me. This is who I am. This is not a pseudonym. And that's important. Just important that you know that I am who I say I am. Now, moving forward, this particular episode, I probably could have put off indefinitely. The reason is, you'll see, because of the subject matter I'm going to start covering. And as I said, I don't know if I'll even be able to finish covering it because it's so vast. So the impetus of all this was the book that I was hired to read. I was hired to read 2 books. I haven't gotten to the second one yet. The second one is about American archaeology. The first one was a book written about 150 years ago. It was called Adam and the Adamites by Dominic McCausland. Now, I've had some issues for a long time with not only with the way that many identitarians understand the issue of man, the issue of races, because it's so flawed. And it's flawed, you could say it's flawed in a very honest way. I've listened to identitarians who I think are very sincere, but their knowledge base is very flawed. So after reading that book and comprehending his train of thought, mode of thought, his evidences for his conclusions, and finding them very, very disagreeable. And there's a reason. There's a reason I find his conclusions so disagreeable. There's a reason I find conclusions of identitarians disagreeable. There's a reason I find conclusions of the Jews disagreeable, of just about any sect that claims themselves to be either the Hebrews or specifically the Israelites, Judahites of the Bible, disagreeable. The main reason I find them disagreeable is because they're all working from a flawed foundation. Whether that is deliberate and malicious, or whether it's sincere. Because there are people out there that they're quite sincere in their work, I'm sure, but again, they're working with flawed foundations and flawed information. I produced 2 presentations within the last, 6 months. One of them was, what is OBRY and why does it matter? And the other one was the word, pierced, striped, and bruised. Now, the second spent a lot more time discussing the issues with the Masoretic text. And something you have to understand is all we have are Masoretic texts. They are texts that have been influenced by these phantoms called Masoretes. I call them phantoms because there's really no proof in their existence. And now I know somebody altered these manuscripts in some way. Somebody did that. But it's the specifics of their existence, where they were from, where they worked out of, who the sects of them were, and who they were specifically as individuals. And a lot of it reads a little bit fairy tale-ish and formulaic. But there are a number of assumptions or claims that the Masoretes and the Masoretic text makes. And I went over some of those. For instance, matris lectionis, the idea that vowels could be inserted at will without them affecting the text, the wording, what a word meant. That's a Masoretic claim. And it's an unsubstantiated claim. And of course, the other big one is the vowel points and the way the vowel points affect the text. The vowel points not only affect the text in the sense of how things are pronounced, so everybody who's pronouncing the name of God as Yahweh is using Jewish Masoretic pronunciation rules. That's inescapable. This is why I, to this day, pronounce his name Yahweh, because it's made of those four glyphs, Y, E, U, E. And you don't get A out of E. Okay? You have to stay consistent one way or another. Okay, if you want to call him Yahweh, knock yourself out. But the whole point is, it is inconsistent, and it is based on Masoretic rules. Now, one of the other things I pointed out in that presentation is the fact that Jews of old admit that even their letters themselves that we call Hebrew, they're not original. And we have a lot of examples floating around of the more original letter. And that more original letter bears a striking resemblance to our current alphabets, Germanic, Western European English alphabets. And same with the phonetics. Okay. They admit that that look that they even applied to it is Assyrian. Why is it Assyrian? Because Ashur, which is the real name of Assyria, Ashur brought a number of peoples into the territories of the 10 tribes of Israel that they had displaced. And then there were more brought by Babel. But it was those that were brought from Ashur and planted there that began all of these issues concerning the text of scriptures, the manuscripts, and the changing of it. And you can read about it in 2 Kings 17. You will read again a poor translation, but you will get the gist. This was the foundation, and the work of the Masoretes, as far as what they've done to the text, was likely something that was organic, and we can see that because they don't tend to agree. It took a very long time for them to get to the point where they agreed. This was a process. I believe, now this is just based on what I see in the texts and what I understand about the people who have done this to the texts and have been controlling information for a really long time, that what they had to do was they had to simultaneously go about rounding up as many pure texts as possible while producing impure texts with the Masoretic dots and dashes, which they not only dictate the phonetics of these words instead of keeping the phonetics consistent based on the glyphs that are the obvious predecessors of our modern or current language and alphabet and the way that those things are pronounced. They also affected the definition of words. So oftentimes one word, the same word, which contains a concept, that word would be broken apart, and through their dots and dashes, if they put different Masora around the word, different nikudot around the word, which that just the word nikud just comes from the idea of piercing, okay, like dots. They would change, let's say, the same concept that appeared in the same verse. There are instances where absolutely the same concept, same root, can appear 2 times in the same verse, but be interpreted as a different word, and it's because of that system, that coded system that they applied to the words themselves. So what we have to do if we want to understand any of this, because we're getting a lot wrong, and if we continue to get all of this wrong, it doesn't matter how hard, if we get the foundations wrong, if we get the concepts, the ideas wrong, it doesn't matter how hard we work and we strive. It doesn't matter how many endless hours we spend in word studies. We're going to keep getting it wrong. Because word studies, when somebody takes a specific word, and let's say they find the entry in Strong's, well, first off, they're not appreciating the fact that that word, that root, may also be found in a number of other words. And those will actually help to understand what that word really means. But secondarily, they oftentimes are not appreciating the fact that if they were to take a word and they were to compare it across a broad number of contexts, they may get a good sense across all of those different contexts that they compare it in. They may get a good sense of its overall usage. However, they're not appreciating the fact that in any given texts, and in many passages, in fact, that they're going to go to do cross-references in, that those passages also contain a number of words which have been parsed out, which have been redefined, which are probably not defined correctly, and the whole passage actually probably, well, not probably, but definitely needs to be translated, and translated correctly. Translated correctly apart from Masoretic. Now, the way I've gone about doing this, of course, is to recognize these as glyphs and to list out all of the simplest 2-glyph roots available, biglyph roots. The roots that you mostly see in OBRY mostly are 2-glyph and 3-glyph, biglyph and triglyph. Now, you will have some words that will appear to be compounds, 2 biglyph root words, so 4 glyphs. But for the most part, we're looking at biglyphs, and those biglyphs are making the triglyph words. Okay, so oftentimes if you go, say, to like Jewish learning sites, they're going to teach you how to learn Hebrew. They're oftentimes going to tell you that a roots word is mostly 3, and that's not so. They're mostly 2. 2 is the most basic root you can find, because you have one glyph which it bears an idea or a concept. And then you'll have a second glyph which bears an idea or a concept. And those two together, just like the simplest sentence one can form in English, will give you a concept. Okay? Now you can add to that concept by putting certain specific glyphs before it, because its position in the word always matters. It's why ab, is used as father, and ba, is used to come in or to enter. So the glyph placement matters. You can put a certain glyph at the beginning of the word. You can put a certain glyph at the end of the word, and it's going to matter. It's going to slightly change the word. That root will still be the same, but the glyph that you use and where you put it, and actually there are some glyphs that you can actually insert between those glyphs, and you can change the aspect of the concept slightly. Now, the only two that I've ever found that work consistently in doing that are the Y, which is the predecessor of today's I, that the Jews call Yod, and the U, or the predecessor of our modern U, which the Jews will call Vav or Wa, depending on which school you're asking. So that's the way that these words are built. And we have to look at all of these words, we have to look at all of these glyphs, and we have to start deciding based on the best information that we have about these glyphs, the remnants that still remain of these old glyphs that some people call Paleo-Hebrew. I call it OBRY because that's exactly how it would be pronounced if you look at the word and understand that we're looking at a language with an alphabet that is strikingly similar, strikingly familiar with what we use to this day. It's just that today, what they have done is drained the inherent meaning from the glyphs, and they call them letters. They have drained the inherent meaning of what those glyphs do when you start combining them into simple roots, and then start accenting those simple roots, and then you start putting those words that you've formed in context with other words that are made up of either simple roots, two being the least amount. There's no OBRY word made up of a single glyph. It has to be at least two, because these are concepts. And you have to put that into context. Context is very, very important, and that's another reason why word studies are just no good. You have to do concept studies. You have to do passage studies. These words don't exist all on their own. You can take a word, whether it's benign or seems less than benign. You can take a word like chair, and if you don't have that word in proper context, you're really not going to know what was meant when somebody said that word. It has to be contextualized. So word studies just aren't any good. And the problem is that most people today, and in McCausland's time, and we see that with McCausland because McCausland uses Hebrew. If I say Hebrew, that means Masoretic. If I say OBRY, that means the language without the Masoretic. Even McCausland was doing it. And today they're still doing it, and they're still using Masoretic. They're still using Hebrew, and they're trying to get to the truth of things, and it's just not going to happen. So it started with that book, in a sense, because there was a lot that I wanted to comment on, but of course, I was hired to read the book. I was not hired to comment as I went. So I thought, well, I'll comment afterwards. And I specifically wanted to take another look at origins. because I've been very dissatisfied with what I've seen and heard so far based on what I knew of the scriptures. Now, I do spend most of my time, when I can, working on the geographical question. But I do spend a lot of other time working on other concepts. I do spend a decent amount of time in the New Testament and testing and trying the works of the New Testament to see if they line up with the scriptures of what's called the Old Testament. But I really hadn't planned on putting the kind of time into looking at these origins, which is what McCausland's talking about. He's talking about origins. As I have. And as I said, I could spend a heck of a lot more time looking at it too. So what I found when I went about doing this was that there are words and concepts that are right there in the Bible, starting at Genesis 1, that we have completely ignored, that we have taken them for granted, that they are what the Masoretes have told us that they are. And they help to illustrate why word studies, as we understand them, just are no good. We have to look at the word, and we have to look at the root. We have to look at the cognates of that root. We have to gather up all of the words that have that root, how they are used, and come to some conclusions about what the most likely meaning and usage of that root is. Now, I've been forming a table of all of the simple two-glyph roots that I could find. I've been doing this for quite a long time. And in conjunction with this table, I'm also creating a translation into English of the OBRY scriptures. Now, this is quite involved because what happens is, as I get to each and every single individual word, I have to go to my roots table, and I have to find the roots of that word. Now, if it's a word that is quite long, I may actually have to go and fill in all of the cognates for multiple roots. And this takes a very, very long time. And it was my intention to start publishing this table as is on my website, on the resources page, just every couple of weeks, because I'm adding sections to that table all the time. The problem is that I set this up with, what is it called? I'm sorry, is it called cross-references? I was thinking bookmarks. I set it up with cross-references so that you can easily navigate to any given glyph. And within that glyph, you can easily navigate to one of the 22 variations. So if you were in the letter T, you could select to navigate to TA, TB, TG, TD, TE, TU, TZ, TH, TTH, TY, TK, TL, TM, TN, TSTO, TP, TTSA, TQ, TR, TSH, or TT. Okay. And it made it's very easy when you use it in LibreOffice because the cross-references work really well. Unfortunately, there is a problem that, to my knowledge, still exists in LibreOffice, and that is putting it into a PDF. I don't know what it is with LibreOffice, but when you put it in a PDF, these cross-references don't work right. And for anyone who has looked at any of my documents that I've put up, and they've tried using the cross-references in them, in the PDF form, notice they weren't working right. That's why. And I haven't yet figured out if I can easily export it, say, into Word and then open it in Word as a Word file, and then export it as a PDF from there, and then it'll work right or not. But all these things take time, and I am basically the start and finish of all of my activity. I have to do it all myself. So, on top of doing pure study, there's all of these complicated things. There's me having to fight with the video sites where I upload. For instance, BitChute. BitChute makes it a total nightmare for me to upload videos to them. I would say 60-70% or more of my video uploads fail. And you have to take time every time you have to try to upload to BitChute again. So, there's reasons for this. Now, anybody who wanted to take a look at this roots table and use this roots table, and let's say they had LibreOffice and they could just open it in LibreOffice and use it in LibreOffice, that's fine. I'll send it. If I find anybody posting these tables that and they have been distorted, or they're being used as basically a tool to confuse, I will take action, because this is my work that I'm producing, and I am not allowing anyone to reproduce it. No one has the permission to reproduce this, okay? But people can use it. And this table is going to take quite a long time to finish. Even when everything is filled in, it's going to take a long time to go over everything, make sure everything is correct, make sure the interpretation of the roots and the root combinations are correct. This is why I decided to start publishing it early, so anybody who was a serious student and wanted to use this could, and it was available. But as I said, there are problems. So let's talk about origins. All right. And, before we do that, this is really important. There's these assumptions. There's these assumptions that, most of us were taught these assumptions from the earliest age. So no matter if we want to or not, we bring these assumptions with us to studying and understanding the Bible, to trying to delve into and understand the origins of this creation, the origins of man, and in some cases, who man is not. There are these assumptions that really cause a whole lot of confusion. And I have to address those before I can even get to any of this stuff. Because they're one of the biggest things that's retarding good progress. And one of those assumptions is the idea of salvation. So this, of course, becomes a big argument. And people get so impassioned about this because they have this notion about what makes people special, what makes people distinct. And of course, most whites are under attack by another group that are essentially white, even though in many instances they certainly have miscegenated and mixed their seeds. But we have one group that is warring on another group and many groups, and they are using other races to do that. They are using them as their players in this war in a lot of ways. So it's really natural and understandable for the group that is being warred upon, that is being killed, that is being oppressed, that is being wounded, that is being slandered, and whose lives are being made hell by these other people by these other races because they're being used as a weapon against them. That's a fact. So it's completely understandable for them to grab onto, say, an idea like in Christian identity, which believes that, only a certain select people can be saved. But we have to look at and understand even that concept of salvation. Because I think that's one of those fundamental concepts that we've gotten really wrong. Really wrong. And we need to look at the whole Bible and try to understand this concept of salvation. Because where we mostly are seeing and getting this concept of salvation from is specifically from the New Testament. And really, it is utterly unevenly weighted in the New Testament as far as our concept of what salvation is. It is grossly influenced more by this character, Paul, than by anything or anyone else. His ideas about just about everything have, in practice, in the churches, and even in CI, they have grossly outweighed the words, the deeds, the concept that Jesus, you show, ever communicated. So when we think of salvation, in Greek, the word is sozo, the root sozo. But let's think about that, because sozo, interestingly enough, bears a striking resemblance to the OBRY root show. You'll find the OBRY root show in the actual real name of Jesus, you show. Now, if you don't really think that's his name, you need to look at the Greek and understand that this English word, Jesus, this English fiat transliteration, Jesus, it comes from only one way that his name is presented in the Gospels. His name, at its root, is presented as Isu. Yisu. Now, sometimes you can put the suffix s, sometimes they put the suffix n. They do the same thing with Udeion, because the root is Ude, which is just a transliteration of Yude from OBRY. So, without rabbit trailing that too much, even sozo would appear to be from the root show, which we found in his name, you show. Show, you can look show up, it means salvation. Sometimes you'll see it as shu-o. And it does quite literally mean it's a very real physical act of saving someone from impending doom or from their current distress. There is not particularly anything spiritual applied to it whatsoever throughout scriptures. What we have is we have interpretations of that applied to it. And again, we're looking at a lot of those interpretations being extracted from the Pauline writings. If you look at the whole story in context, you will see that actually Israel and Judah certainly did need saving. And they were actually promised that they would be saved. Specifically, all of the outcasts that were divorced by Yahweh, and it's most abundantly apparent, of course, in the book of Hosea, who actually has almost the same exact name as the man we call Jesus. So they had been outcast. And if we read Deuteronomy 28, we can see what that entails as part of the covenant that was struck between our long-gone forefathers out in the wilderness between Mitzrim and Canaan and Yahweh. They were promised that they would be greatly multiplied and that they would be remarkably transformed. When we're talking about remarkably transformed here and now in this life into what they were supposed to be, into what we were meant to be, and that they would eventually take the place that they were meant to take when that transformation had happened. This idea of salvation, the way that people look at it and they think about it, is very subjective from person to person. Anybody who has looked at any of the literature from one of many, many denominations out there will know for a fact that depending on the denomination you go to, their idea of what the criteria for salvation is can change dramatically. They have incantations that one has to do to be saved. Or they say, well, there's no incantations. It's simply, I'll use their language, it's simply God who does it. But they still apply a lot of other assumptions to this idea in the sense that they look at it as sort of entirely a spiritual thing with either an implicit or explicit outcome of being, when you die, you will go to either heaven or hell. Or some of them will get the resurrection part right, and they will say that salvation means that when you die, you'll be resurrected to eternal life. But they tend to always put it in this futuristic, spiritual sort of context, instead of looking at it as something that is very real and very practical here and now. It involves a nation, an entire people, and their behavior, the situation that they were in, and the situation they were going to be delivered from, and how they were going to, at a point, stay delivered from that situation because their behavior would be absolutely changed. Now, it's true that salvation does imply something spiritual. But this idea of who can be saved in the sense of now you're a Christian and you're different because you said an incantation or because God decided to do something to you. So, now there's this and that. There are so many interpretations of what the implications are for that I couldn't even begin to cover them all. But that idea of salvation, as most tend to interpret it today, is at the root of the problems with just looking very objectively at the creation and the creation of man, the creation of races. And again, everything I'm saying right here is being said in a context that has been designed, linguistically designed, to support the current popular narrative. And if we're going to take an objective look at it and see what the truth may in fact be, as opposed to what we've all been taught, what's been impressed upon us, what's been imposed and forced upon us, we're going to have to first off admit that salvation may not be what we've been thinking it is for a long time. We may have to admit that Yahweh sees not a formula. There's not some kind of formula for being saved. There are certainly prophecies. Those prophecies pertain to a nation of people and what he was going to do in this nation and how he was going to use this nation to effect change in the world that he made. If we are not willing to at least suspend our assumptions, our preconceived notions, and especially our desires about what we wish to be, then we're going to have a very hard time finding out what actually is. So let's actually take a look at the word sozo in its various forms in the New Testament, because that's the root word that is translated as salvation. It is where a lot of these ideas, and more than ideas, it's the foundation for so many beliefs that are wrapped up in so much emotion. And something we have to understand, and this is a fact. The fact is that whether you want to believe that the New Testament was originally written in this language called Greek or not, that there is a very large amount of words in this so-called Koine Greek that don't have any sort of a provable root, foundation, and more likely appear to be rooted and founded in OBRY, transliterated, and oftentimes Greek prefixes and suffixes and variations imposed upon them. Okay? So, look, in Matthew 1:21, let's see, Joseph is being spoken to. We'll say Matthew 1:18. Now the birth of Yesu, and then they say Christos, was on the wise when, as his mother Mary was espoused to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Ghost. Then Joseph and her husband, being a just man, and not willing to make her a public example, was minded to put her away privily, which was his right under the law, if he found his wife wanting, immoral. He was absolutely in the law, not by tradition, in the law. It was his right to put her away, to send her away, to essentially to divorce her. But while he thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost. And she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Yesu, for he shall sozo his people from their sins. Now, it's striking. One thing you need to understand. If you look at, for instance, the Greek in the Septuagint, which is Koine, and the Greek in the New Testament, which is Koine, one thing you'll find to be interesting, remarkable, is when you come across, for instance, names, things that are utterly obvious, and you see that this language that has been imposed upon the text, that it is first off based on phonetics. It is not letter for letter. It is phonetically based, for one thing, which is why you can find in some cases one letter being used to, phonetically transliterate a sound in a name or another word. And in another case, you'll find another letter or letters. You will find this in words that maybe you can't even prove have a root in another language, which if we're talking about the Bible, the root is going to be commonly OBRY. Not Aramaic, for the most part, depending. But the whole point is, there is not a consistency to the way that they use these just arbitrary phonetics to transliterate these words. So, interestingly enough, you will find in some cases they'll use an omicron, which is an O, in a transliteration, and in the same word later on that they're transliterating, they'll use omega, which is O. And so what you have to do is, since there isn't always this consistency, you have to look at the word. Is there a good excuse for where it came from in the Greek, or is there not? And is there a most likely OBRY root word that it was actually just transliterated from? Now, in the case of Yesu, that has all of the earmarks of being transliterated, of course, from the OBRY Yusho. That would just be a Y, probably not an E, though, for instance, the name of Joshua, who led Israel into Canaan, his name would be Y-E-U-Sh-O. E-U-Sho, okay? In this case, it's more likely that his name came from just Y-U-Sh-O, Yusho, which essentially is the verb form of the concept of salvation. The concept of salvation in the sense of extraction. The way that you would extract oil from an olive. It's the reason, like for instance, that Moses got his name Moshe. It's M-Sh-E, Moshe. The She glyph, which the Jews call Shin, it actually bears with it the idea of pressure. However, in many words that it's used for this idea of pressure, other glyphs are applied around it, which actually mean to extract via pressure. So that's why, for instance, Moses, Moshe, was given his name, because he was extracted. You extract through applying pressure. That's where the whole idea comes from of these sh root words. So his name was most likely in OBRY Y-U-Sh-O, Yusho. And we see that in the phonetics of the Greek. It's Yesu, Yesu. Now, you can't find an exact equivalent if you were to type in, for instance, like Y-E-Sh-O. You're not going to find it. Or if you even try to U at the end of that, okay? And it completely makes sense why he would be named what he was named, Yesho, because he was going to, and then we get into another arbitrary transliteration here, sozo. Now, it's common in Koine to transliterate the sho into sigma, S. It's also common to transliterate other similar letters. The letters that they'll translate into the sigma S, the glyphs that they'll transliterate, are commonly Z, Tsa, Sha, and S. 4 different glyphs that they will arbitrarily translate into sigma, S. They will also arbitrarily transliterate it into zeta, Z. So we have this idea of you will name him Yusho, which is the verb of the concept show, save, extract. And then we have this other verb. You will name him Yusho because he will sozo. That's the root. Now you can find this simple root sho in OBRY, and it is, as I click to get there, if you give me a moment, I have to do this on the fly. You will find it in OBRY. You'll find it in listings H3467, H3468, H8159, and H8173. Show. Now, in H3467 and 68, those are combined to be used nearly, well, it's about 241 times, and very consistently in the sense of save or salvation. And we might take a look at that and how that's applied. Now, in the other listings, for instance, when it shows up as shoet, it has that feminine. Again, we're not talking about genders per se, though it can be used to identify gender, but that's not necessarily why a feminine ending is used. But anyways, and it's translated in a similar way, sometimes as regard. And again, in H8173, it appears as sho. Now, in the Strong's listing, it appears as sho o with 2 O's at the end. However, when you look at it in the text, and this is part of the deception of Strong's and other concordances, and this is, again, part of the problem with doing word studies. You have to do studies in the text, and you have to translate and study the full context. But it oftentimes, more often than not, it appears as sho. Now, oftentimes, they'll translate that as delight. But we can see with all kinds of other roots that when the writer wanted to use a concept that was augmented by itself, they would double it up. Now, in some cases, they might use 2 aspects of the same concept. You'll see that with like mut yamat, and it's translated as die the death, but both of those roots mean death. In the first case, it is relaying the concept, the static concept. And in the second case, it is relaying the action of. So sometimes it's shown as 2 words when the concept has to be shown and the action of has to be shown. But sometimes when literally the root is going to be used to augment itself, it will be shown simply as a repeat, a double, sho. Now, it is often translated as delight, but essentially, we're talking about, let me give you a good concept. If show is salvation, and you double that, you actually put another one after that. So saving the saved in the sense of, well, as I said, augmentation. I don't want to use the word hyperbole, but that's exactly how double roots are often used, and you'll find a lot of double roots. They're simply in one word, just repeating the word twice for the purposes of augmenting it. So we go back to the New Testament, we have the Greek, and we see that the angel is telling Joseph his name is going to be Yusho, the root of that being show, salvation, and it is the verb form. His name was literally going to be salvation as a verb. He was going to be named what he was going to do. And what he was going to do? Shozo, shosho. You can look at all of the Koine examples of this word that they present as sozo, and you're going to find it in a number of different forms. Its root being show. So does it make sense that he would say, you're going to name him Yusho, which has a very obvious OBRY root, show, salvation. He's going to save, the act of salvation, Yusho. Because he's going to, and then he uses a Greek word, sozo. It doesn't make any sense. But if he was using an OBRY word, and they arbitrarily transliterated that into Greek as sozo, then you would understand. He's telling him his name is going to be to save, because he is going to save in an augmented form his people from their sins. And what was their sins? We can get into that because we know what their sins were. We know who his people were. We know what their condition was. We know why they needed salvation and what they needed salvation from. We have it all in the Old Testament. We have all of that history there. We know what happened to the children of Israel via the 10 northern tribes. We know what happened to the greater bulk of what's called the southern tribes too, Judah, Benjamin, Levi. The greater bulk of them were carried away. The greater bulk of them were far away from the land given to our father Jacob. And not a tiny land over in the Middle East, but a good land, a broad land, a land running with springs and fountains of waters, a land in which we never hungered or wanted for bread, a land in which we dug all manners of ores out of the rocks and out of the earth, out of the mountainsides, a land that was enormous, a land that was so big as to give inheritances to all of the millions of Israel that came into the land with tons of extra land for them to grow into. And remember that instead of doing as Yahweh commanded and utterly getting rid of, cutting off many of the inhabitants there, they let them stay there and charged them tribute. So they were all living there too. The idea that this is happening in Palestine is such an absurdity. However, I won't go too far into that. But we know that they were all cast away from this very good land and a life that was very good too. Now there's a lot to that. There's a lot to them living there. There's a lot to who lived there with them. And there's a lot to the sort of life that they were to live and how that translated into everyone else around them and the entire world, and how their dispersion, their casting away from the good land was going to affect them and the rest of their kind and the whole world, the whole creation and all creatures, and how they were, as per the agreement with our forefathers, going to be brought back into this good, large land and given far more land, because they were promised to be given a lot of the land of a lot of the neighboring nations as well. But however, we know that that is the condition. So saving people from their sins, that's fine. We'll go with sins here. We'll go with the Greek hamartia, and we might compare that to the words used for sin and transgression and missing the mark in OBRY in the Old Testament too. At some point, it's possible. But you have to understand it in context. That's salvation. That is the salvation he was there to effect. Now, there is a lot to that. And as we go through the prophets, we'll see what there was to that. There really is an aspect to this that is more than simply physical. But the preconceived notions that we tend to apply to it and our desires that we tend to apply to it, the notion that most churches out there apply to it, and even the Jews in their literature like the Talmud apply to it, this idea of being saved from an eternal hell is the worst possible error that we can make, because the evidence for an eternal hell, first off, is utterly shoddy in the New Testament, given the fact that there's at least 3 words that are translated as hell, for one thing, and in the Old Testament, we're simply not going to find it. The best we're going to find in the Old Testament is literally the grave or the pit. Death. Going in the ground, falling in a pit. Being destroyed. In the Old Testament, when destruction was talked about, it was here and now, because we are here and now. Now, yes, there is an aspect to this that we have to deal with. The aspect that we have to deal with, for one thing, is the idea of life and how long that life was to be and to whom that life was given and in what portions, what the implications of that are, and what the implications are of a renewal of all of the damage that has been done to the creation, and how far the atom has fallen, and what those implications are for his kind and for all creatures in the creation. These are concepts that people have been wrestling with for a very long time. Certainly ever since the scriptures were converted into religion. We've had nothing but struggle and struggling with these things. Now, as I said, we certainly do see that there would be a change made to Israel and Judah. So when you see the house of Israel and the house of Judah used together, that is referring to the entirety of the children of Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. Now, those changes that are promised to affect them, they're not given a specific time frame, but we are not talking necessarily about individuals. We are talking about an entire people. We are talking about the fullness of a people and the expression of them as a people to be changed very much from what they once were and how they once acted, and changing them into a people that quite literally did not have the laws and the statutes and the judgments written on a book for them to follow, which they really did not do, not as a people, but they would have those instead written on their insides. It would become the laws, statutes, and judgments, the character expressed by Yahweh in his commandments, would essentially, he would make them an integral part of who the house of Israel and the house of Judah were. He did not promise this to anyone else. He promised this to the house of Israel and the house of Judah, the people that he chose to strike this covenant with. Again, do not make the mistake of just bringing assumptions and preconceived notions about what salvation is, or anything of the like. Because there are going to be a number of things that we're going to see that are going to challenge all of the dogmas that currently exist. Okay? So I'm not really making any judgments here. I'm showing you concepts. And I'm showing you why we tend to become so emotional about these concepts, and we can't bring all of this, all of these high emotions to this. We have to look at it as objectively as possible. We've got to do the best to remove our own current situation, our own current suffering, our own current pain. We have to try to remove ourselves from that, or, divorce that from our emotions, or divorce our emotions from our reasoning, and just look at it objectively. Because there's no way we're really going to get to the truth if we can't look at these things objectively. So understanding the reason that the son of David, certainly my king, was named what he was named, Yusho, because he was going to save. The concept is show, the verb is the yi, Yusho. He was going to save. And the word for save is a transliteration in this very strange language called Koine Greek, where they translated it and present it as sozo, though that same root, the so, is presented in variable forms. We see that, like I said, in the name of Jesus himself, Yesu, Yesun, Jesus. We see those variations all the time. So we have this root of show. And if we go through these examples of this root of show, presented as a Koine Greek word sozo, just looking at it in context and in basic King James English concepts, and starting at the front of the New Testament, just looking through what is the use of this word. The first point we get to is Matthew 8:25, and the disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we perish." Because there was a violent storm, and they thought that they were going to be capsized, swept off the boat. They thought they were going to be not damned to hell. They thought they were going to be killed. They thought their lives were going to be lost. So they said, "Save us, preserve us, our lives, not our souls or our spirits." And those are also ideas that we have brought to and applied to the text, usually incorrectly. So there's Matthew 9:21. There's the girl who touches his garment so that she will be what? It says, "For she said within herself, if I may but touch his garment, I shall be." And they didn't use saved. It's the same word, right? It's sozo, the root show. They said, "I shall be whole, preserved." How? Her soul? No, her physical being, because she She's a woman. She's flesh and blood. She is a creature that was made, and she is alive. And she said, if I touch his robe, because she knew his reputation, I will be made whole, preserved, saved, show. Okay? And then there's the response by Yeshua himself. He says, daughter, be of good comfort. Thy faith has made thee whole. They didn't say save or salvation. Same word. And you always got to think, what is the context? What is it referring to? Is it referring to something in the future, something that happens after death? Or is the application of it practical here and now and based on our existence? So, Matthew 10:22, this is while Yeshua himself is teaching, and he's telling his disciples, this should be at the tail end of the Sermon on the Mount, and he's telling people what's going to happen to those who are his disciples. Matthew 10:22, you shall be hated of all for my name's sake, but he that endures to the end shall be saved. Now, when we consider that concept in the context of the Old Testament, like specifically think of Ezekiel 3, a good man who turns from his good ways later on in life, all of those good ways and those good deeds of his will not be remembered, and he will perish. Okay? An evil man who is turned from his evil ways to good shall be preserved. He just said, he who endures to the end will be saved. But if we want to apply our preconceived notions to this about heaven and hell and the afterlife, then we're going to get an entirely different idea out of this. And we can go on and on for many, 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 many examples. There's Matthew 14:30, when he saw the wind boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, this is Peter, beginning to sink, he cried, saying, Lord, save me. This is not spiritual, this is physical here and now. And we're going to find the vast majority of all of the occurrences of this sozo, which is more likely than not based on just what we saw about the angel telling Joseph why Yeshua's name would be Yeshua. That its root is show, and show absolutely means to save, and that means in a very real, very visceral, here and now way. So we have H3467. I told you that is the root. That is the greatest. Let's see. H3467. I have to type this in, and eSort is not responding for some reason. So I'll try 68. It's probably doing that because 67 should be combined with 68, and it's still not responding. So let me just do this right now in Blue Letter Bible, because I use that a lot too. All right, so here we got H3467. Now this is presented as a verb. Yesho. That's right, Yesho. And that is very, very close to what his name would be. Yesho. In fact, I'm arbitrarily just putting the U in because of the way they transliterated it in Koine Greek. But I can type it in, and I can see that it is actually used in the form of E, U, Sh, O. Okay? But Strong's is presenting it as only Y, Sh, O without the U. It's fine. It appears with the U plenty of times. So it could have been just Y, U, Sh, O, U, Sho, or Yesho. Anyways, So it's translated in, as is the typical case, a bunch of ways. Saved 149 times, Savior 15 times, Deliver 13 times, Help 12 times, Preserved 5 times, Salvation 3 times, Avenging 2 times, At all. Are you kidding? At all? Yes, at all. 1 time. Avenged 1 time. Defend 1 time, Rescue 1 time, Safe 1 time, Victory 1 time. And you guys want to follow the Masoretes? You guys who claim to be scholars that are bringing us the truth, you want to follow the Masoretes? Because so much of this confusion comes from their manuscripts. And no, the Koine Greek Septuagint is not better. It's not. It's confusion just as much as the Koine Greek New Testament is. Come on. Let's be grown-ups. So let's look at it. And Exodus 2:17. And the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and Yisho. He helped them. Here and now. He preserved them. He protected their life and well-being. Yisho. And thus, so Exodus 14:30, and so thus Yahweh saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Mitzri, not Egyptians, Mitzri. And Israel saw the Mitzri dead upon the seashore. How did he save them? From an eternal hell? No, he saved them physically here in this creation, the creation he made, for us to dwell in, for us to live in, for those in covenant with him to prosper or to not prosper, depending on, mostly on their action, and sometimes depending on what he sees is best for the refining of an individual or people. We see that, for instance, in the book of Job. But anyways, you can go on. Numbers 10:9. Before Yahweh your God, and you shall be saved from your enemies. Again, we see over and over and over again the threats that people are saved from are real, material, physical things here and now. Deuteronomy 22:27, for he found her in the field, and the betrothed damsel cried, and there was none to save her. Here and now, there was none to save her. That means any other person could have saved her. That's the same word. Yisho. That's the same root. Sho. To save. And we're not talking about just Yahweh Elohim, the Lord God, in English. We're talking about anyone to save her. That's what you're going to see over and over again when you review this OBRY root show, that the word, because of the context we just saw with our Lord's name, that sozo is more likely than not from the OBRY root show. Logically and reasonably, we have to conclude that it is more likely than not that sozo is from the OBRY root show. All right. So there you have salvation. That's salvation. So the idea and the preconceived notions that we're bringing with us is this idea about salvation that isn't reflected in the Bible. Who did Yeshua come to save? His people. Who are his people? They are the house of Israel and the house of Judah.
That's his people. By extension, their kind, and that would trickle down to everyone else, starting with their kind, and so on and so forth. This all has a ripple effect on the whole world and the whole creation, the salvation of Israel. The salvation of Israel, the selection of Israel, making Israel special and unique, and everything else, just as Yahweh had told our forefathers. He didn't select us because we were great or anything else about us ourselves. He did it for the glory of his own namesake. But he did do it, and there is a people made of 12 tribes that he promised, because of covenants made between him and our forefathers, to save them and to change them in very fundamental ways, which would make them which would put them correctly into the position and the status that we were supposed to hold from the start. And so what we need to do is we need to look at the start. We need to look at the foundation. We need to look at least the first few chapters of Genesis. We always have to go back to Genesis, and we always have to look very closely at Genesis when we're trying to figure out our origins, foundations, who everyone is. But before we do that, we have to not bring preconceived notions to it. You see, when people go out there and they start saying things like, well, the Jews are incapable of being saved, the blacks are incapable of being saved. Okay, well, if you're talking about specifically what, for instance, the angel was talking about to Joseph in Matthew 1, or if you're talking about most of the quotes from Yeshua himself throughout the gospel, then yeah, that's true, because he was here to save in a very real way in time, in this creation, his people, the house of Israel and the house of Judah, from their sins. And their sins are the total expression of all of their disobedience from the law that wound up getting them kicked out of the land, vomited from the land, and out of the sight of, the blessings of, the good nature of the Father, Yahweh, who made these covenants with our fathers and intended, will keep them all the way through while this creation is in existence. So that's the implication, and that's the sins that we were to be saved from. We know that if we follow the storyline. So if we put all of those preconceived notions aside about what salvation is. Now, can anyone be saved? Well, yeah. I mean, anyone can be saved. Like, you put any kind of people, I don't care who they are, you put any kind of people, they're in a flood, drowning, and I go out there with a boat and I pull them out. They've been saved. Can anybody be saved through what Yeshua did, his work in that self-sacrifice and making himself an offering as an exchange, in a way, offering himself as an exchange and an offering for all of that disobedience and all of that sin. Can anybody be saved by him in that way? No. The house of Israel and the house of Judah. Now, that saving act has, for a long time now, since he came and he did that, that saving act has spread out in the way of not only having the effect of converting those people who are of the house of Israel and the house of Judah in the way it's described in Jeremiah. Let me just go to that real quick. It is Jeremiah chapter 31, starting in verse 31. And I know that the author of Hebrews repeats this, but in Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah, Yahweh says through the prophet, "Behold, the days come, saith Yahweh, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah." Now the old covenant was, they kept his laws, statutes, and judgments as he handed down to them, and if they did, they would get all sorts of blessings and be able to stay in the land. This is in Deuteronomy 28, where he says what blessings you'll get if you keep the law, statutes, and judgments, and what cursings you'll get if you do not. But this is a new covenant. Jeremiah's prophesying it. Yahweh's prophesying it through Jeremiah. I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's it. That's who he names. That's who the new covenant is with. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Mitzrim, which my covenant they break, although I was a husband unto them, saith Yahweh. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my law in their inward parts, and I will write it in their hearts. I will be their aliyim, and they shall be my people. So that's, you want to know who salvation applies to, that's it. It's the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Again, do not bring your desires. Do not bring your wants. Do not bring your pagan beliefs about what heaven and hell are. Let's just look at and concentrate on the text. Now that salvation, before we get upset, if we are somebody who doesn't appear to have the abundant markings and signs of who the house of Israel and the house of Judah are today, if you happen to be one of those people, do not become upset over this, because for one thing, we're going to see throughout the text, once we understand our origins, the origins of Adam, all the origins, once we understand that, we understand who everybody is. This is not something that people need to get upset over. In fact, it's a very, very good thing that Yahweh has promised to save the house of Israel and the house of Judah. Okay? And now keep this in mind, and this should just be another very clear, stark reason the Jews are not Israel. They are not Judah. Is because just as he promised that salvation that he would effect on the house of Israel and the house of Judah, so Jacob altogether, just as he promised to do that through the prophet Jeremiah, and he fulfilled that in the acts that were done by Yeshua long after that. Just as he promised those good things, he has kept his promise in all the curses on Israel. And you can't look at the Jews and say, well, they're an awful people. They're a nasty people that use usury, and they do foul, despicable things, and they have warred on humanity and so on and so forth as them being accursed. That's not the curses that he promised. All of those curses that he promised, those things do not befall the Jews. The Jews, in fact, have to lie about history in order to make it appear that some, not all, some of those things have befallen them. So, while he did promise only this salvation to the house of Israel and the house of Judah, and it's not the salvation that a lot of you are bringing to this because you've been taught wrong, or your desires want you to believe in this heaven and hell and this ethereal, mystical, otherly thing. We're talking about salvation as we can understand it in the Bible. That salvation was promised to Israel and Judah alone. But those curses from Deuteronomy 28 were promised also to Israel and Judah alone. And the people who comprise the blood children of Jacob, Israel, have suffered those curses. And they suffer those curses to this day. And suffering those curses, you can't just sit there and say, well, my people have suffered those curses because our life sucks, or our existence sucks. Maybe your life and existence, or your people's existence, kind of sucks a little bit because you guys are lazy. I don't know. Because there are people that are freaking lazy. And they're poor because they're lazy. As a people, they're lazy. So things suck for them in comparison to people who are industrious, fastidious, who have work ethics. More importantly, to those people who keep the laws, statutes, and judgments of Yahweh. Even people who weren't blood descendants of Jacob Israel, should they keep the laws, statutes, and judgments of Yahweh, they are going to be far more successful in life and have a far more pleasant life in general. So there's no reason to get all angry about this. And that's the problem with so much anger and bile and resentment that people have. Because they're bringing with their desires, or just the things they've been taught from the earliest age. Because believe me, I was taught all kinds of nonsense and lies and dogmas when I was a little child. Okay, so you're not alone. I was taught them too, but we have to put them away if we're going to really understand what the Bible really says, and we're going to get over all of our frustrated butt-hurtness and get down to what the actual facts are. So if we can keep all of that emotion somewhere else, not in the conversation, not in our thought process, if we can keep it divorced from the pure information that we can understand and extract from the Bible, comprehend, we're going to be much, much better off. How does this apply? Does this mean that everybody who is the genetic descendants of Jacob Israel, and I do mean genetic descendants of Jacob Israel, I do not mean those who are spiritual descendants, because look, if it was about a confession, if it was about a spiritual thing, if it was only about your actions, well, then there would have been no reason why Eliezer of Damascus, Abraham's right-hand man, who he had essentially adopted. Oh, there's that concept of adoption. Who he had essentially adopted, and he had planned on everything of his house, his whole inheritance, going to Eliezer. If the genetic seed didn't matter, and your profession or your actions, because Eliezer, by the way, he was a very faithful servant of Abraham. He was like his son. And Abraham saw him as a son to him. If that's all that mattered, then Yahweh could have made his covenant with Abraham through Eliezer. But it was his seed through Sarah, the seed of promise that mattered. And it has been through the seed from Adam to Abraham, to all of the tribes of Israel, to Yeshua, affecting his salvation on all of the tribes of Israel, and how that will affect us as a nation, and how the reforming of that nation on a fundamental spiritual level will affect the entire creation. Now, does that mean every individual who is the blood descendant of Jacob Israel is going to be saved? Whatever that means. Now, we can look at it in either way. If you're just so hard-pressed that you're not going to listen to reason, you're not going to listen to logical process of correctly understanding what the Bible is saying, and you want it to mean something spiritual, like in the transcendent sort of heaven and hell, eternity sort of thing, does every individual who is the blood descendant of Jacob Israel end up with that? No. There were plenty of very wicked descendants that Jacob Israel had. We can see them throughout the scriptures. And there have been many descendants of Jacob Israel from the time of Yeshua forward to our present day who are suffering and dying, and in the worst possible way. It means that nation, that people, is going to be, not is going to be, I shouldn't say that, not as if, but when I say is going to be as far as the work being finished. So we really shouldn't look at it as like the futurists, the evangelical Judeo-Christian futurists look at it as, one day in the future, the Jews who we erroneously attribute as Israel is going to repent. The prophecy I just read from Jeremiah is going to be affected upon them one day. We shouldn't look at it like that. Nor can we look at it like it happened, and now there are the reverberations of it, the effects of it. No, it's been happening. It's been happening. The refining of has been happening. The curses of have been happening as part of the refining. Yahweh the Father is doing a spiritual work in Israel and has been for a very long time. And as per the prophecies in Ezekiel, for one thing, he says that when he gathers us back to that same land that he promised to our forefathers, that there in that land he would finish that refining process. Now, if any of you want to believe, or if anyone else out there wants to believe, that the people without the marks of Israel, living in a land without the marks of Canaan, who have not changed for the better in any way, shape, or form, are not being dealt with in the ways that Yahweh promised our forefathers that he was going to deal with us if we didn't keep the law, a people who are utterly lawless, are being in any way affected or changed, you're not paying any attention. If you believe the Jews are Israel, in spite of the fact that they have no signs or marks of Israel, you're not paying attention. And I'm sorry for you if you believe that Palestine is the land of Canaan, in spite of the fact that it has no markings other than arbitrary names they have put on some places and some geographical features that kind of fit the descriptions in the Bible, but not really. The whole point, though, is this: that he would complete that refining of his people, Israel and Judah, when he brought all of the tribes together as one nation back in the land that he promised to our fathers. You can go and read about this in Ezekiel 35, 6, and 7. Ezekiel chapters 35, 6, and 7. Go and read that. You'll see it. It's right there. And he said, they will have one king over them, even David. Who do you suppose that is? The salvation and the refining is a process being done to a people that will affect everyone in a very positive, good way. And that's the other reason why nobody who is an avid Bible student or pays attention to people, who pays attention to the Jews or who pays attention to the peoples of the world and who they are, how they've been treated, how they act, what the Bible says about them prophetically, and understand who that people is and how they are being refined as a people, as a nation. Now, when we get to the idea of the individual, that's something entirely different. I don't have any formulas for anyone concerning what it is you may have to look forward to in your life, the rest of your life, your health, your existence, your monetary blessings or cursings or status, your death, the manner of your death, and your potential resurrection. I have nothing to say to you because I don't know. I can't tell you. I would not tell any of you anything that I wasn't at least pretty sure of. And if I wasn't totally sure of, I would have to tell you, I'm not totally sure. What religion has done is they have turned a message to a nation that started through one couple who were descended from a certain individual, or actually a certain couple, early on in Genesis, and a nation of people who covenants were made with and promises were made with to change these people as a nation, as a complete people, in very specific, fundamental ways in order to positively affect the creation. They turned that into, instead of a national thing, into an individual thing. And people are so very confused about salvation and what is salvation and what does it mean and how do I know if I'm saved, because they use this word saved, this utterly bizarre concept and word, saved. And you know it's bizarre. You can just look at the way that people use it, the way they act, the unsureness people have and how much they struggle because they are functioning off of this unbiblical belief in what they call salvation. They have turned something that's very biblical and very national into something that is very unbiblical and very personal. As far as you personally, I don't know what to tell you, other than the fact that if I were you, I would invest absolutely all of my energy and my time that I could possibly invest. I would set my mind and my heart on knowing and understanding this person who made everything, who made me, who sustains the creation. And I did call him a person because he is a person. And that's the other problem that we have when we turn salvation into a formula. Because there's no formula to having a relationship with an individual. And that's who and what he has expressed himself as being in the scriptures. He's an individual. He may be an individual that is far higher than us in his mind, in his person, in his powers. That's true. He is an individual and a person who does not have to answer our deepest desires and longings and questions. He doesn't have to answer those because he is sovereign. He has never once spoken to me, but I have his word, and he's given me the ability to study it and to begin to understand it as it was supposed to be understood, as our ancestors really understood it. They weren't wrestling with the language or the concepts or how do we make these things out. They really understood it. He's given me the ability to do that, little by little, over many, many years. And there were many years of troubles and sufferings before that. And there have been, in the meantime, while I have striven so hard and so passionately at coming to understand the truth as he has preserved it for us, I've suffered more than I probably did before I started this. Without a doubt. But he has a reason for that. All suffering has a reason. If you're someone who is devoted to walking with him, and walking with him means obeying him, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you are any color under the sun, no matter what, okay, that means obeying him. And it also means reforming your opinions and your desires to his revealed truth. Loving what he loves, loving who he loves. This is part of developing a relationship with him, not him bending his will to you, but you doing everything to bend your will and your mind and your actions and your understanding to him. Now, if the Bible doesn't teach these concepts of this heaven and hell as we understand it, but instead teaches that when we die, we're dead, we're done, we're over, which is a good thing. People should really warm up to that. It's not a bad thing. If you're not warmed up to that, I have to wonder how much you have actually suffered, how much you have really lived, so that you understand the value of rest. Because when it's done, it's done. And you can rest. Now, is it done forever? You see, the problem that we have is, as much as we have desires, we want to believe something. We have to find the evidence of that in the Bible. We've got to prove it. Now, if we desire something so bad, in opposition to what the truth may be? Well, if you're smart and you're talented and you get to know your way around the Bible pretty good, chances are you might be able to use the language, the terminology, and all the tools that are available, which are all based on either the Masoretic or the Koine Septuagint, which are both corrupt. Or, hey, you can just go to the Latin if you want to. And you might be able to prove, for yourself anyways, somehow, that your desires are founded. But if you want to just look at the facts and what we currently have, facts. The only place you're not going to find, once you dig and get right underneath, the ideas of heaven and hell, as most of the church and even Judaism teaches today. Once you get under those words and you start looking at those concepts, you're going to find out that this idea of heaven and hell are not founded. But then there's going to be some of you who will say, yes, but I see a resurrection. I clearly see that when we die, we're dead. That's it. We're not conscious of anything. We're not having bad dreams. We're dead. We cease to be. We're not living. Okay? Being conscious in some other weird realm would still make us living. We're not living. When we die, we're dead. So then some of you who are more astute, you're going to look at the fact that you see a resurrection. You'll see passages, right, in the New Testament about a resurrection. And what you'll do is you'll figure out, okay, well, these ideas of heaven and hell, they're based on real shoddy translations. They were actually impressed upon the text as opposed to being there naturally. But I do certainly see this idea of a resurrection. Now then, a lot of people who see that, they'll still believe that there's a resurrection and that what happens is everybody gets raised up from the dead, everybody gets judged, and then they have a whole set of beliefs or opinions concerning what happens to people once they're judged. And a lot of those, they're understandable that people have their opinions about that because, look, there's some really harsh realities that we've got to deal with in this world. One of those harsh realities is the fact that guys like Rockefeller, guys like Kissinger, okay, guys like Rothschilds, and way more than I can even mention, will live very, very long lives. Lives that are full of luxury, convenience, opulence, probably all manners of sex that they desire, and just living hedonistically. And they may do that, and they may have that for a long time, for an entire life. We don't know. They're very secretive, so we're not sure how they're living. But they're certainly not living in a way that's kind, that is decent to those people who are not as fortunate as them. And remember, all of these people that we're talking about, what fortunes they have were all, without exception, gotten through criminal behavior. Quite simply, the spoils of war, and not even a man's war, where you go out onto a battlefield and you actually fight it out. No, these were wars of deception, deceit, confusion. These were the this sort of Sun Tzu kind of wars, where they didn't see a battlefield or them on a battlefield. They saw the battlefield as finance. They saw the battlefield as religion. Religion. So don't play into their hands by being so religious and letting your beliefs get the best of you. But we have these questions we got to struggle with. How is it these people, these rotten-ass people, are living these extremely long lives? And then what's going to happen with them? They're going to go into the ground. They're going to cease to be. And then what? What's going to happen? Are they going to be resurrected and simply, given a judgment of death and then die again? And there they go. They cease to exist. And what punishment have they? Because we do have the question of justice, right? We've got that question of justice, and it's just nagging away at us. What about justice? What's going to happen to terrifically evil men that have been the foundation of mass slaughters and starvations and just the most wicked, disgusting, animalistic, brutal acts? The Bolsheviks, Leon Trotsky, the disgusting things that the Russians and the Poles and the Jews did to the Germans after the war. And that's just things that we have better records of because they happened more recently. And you think of how well that they've suppressed even those records that happened in the last century, and how much have they done criminally against other people. Right? We have to wonder that. We have to think about that, right? But are we thinking of everything? Are we looking at the full picture? Because you have to understand there's nothing that happens that Yahweh does not ordain and allow to happen. There's nothing that happens that he is not. You can't remove him from it and say, well, he allows it. He allows it. Yes. But he can also disallow anything that he chooses. He is sovereign over everything. He himself says multiple times in the scriptures that it is he who brings good and it is he who brings evil. And our whole perception of good and evil has got to be changed too. Our understanding of these words from the OBRY scriptures that are translated into good and evil, our concept today of good and evil has to be revised. Because again, our concepts of good and evil today are based on those same kind of non-biblical concepts that are giving us all of these strong emotions concerning heaven, hell, the afterlife, salvation, and so on and so forth. So what's just? I mean, let's think about that. What's just? If someone's disobedient and they get judged for that, and they suffer for that or they die for that, is it indeed radically unjust for someone who, let's say they're not all that bad. They have not been at the business end of murdering thousands, millions, as opposed to someone who has. But they both end up in the end dead. Let's say the one who wasn't at the business end of all of those horrific atrocities, and those of us who have looked into history, even recent history in the last century, and the wars and the revolting acts of man in those wars, we know what people are capable of. And it's oftentimes it just defies reason. It's so atrocious. People who bloodlust, people who would engage in mass rape, things like that. It's so revolting to many of us that we have trouble even comprehending it. I understand that. I think we have to ask and answer some very honest questions. One of those being, is it possible that we are applying a morality, a set of ethics, a system of belief concerning right and wrong, good and evil? Are we applying these subjective beliefs, these desires, these perceptions that we happen to have onto him? I mean, if he allows a pack of lions to hunt down and slaughter a poor, defenseless little doe, are we going to say that he's evil? I mean, that act certainly isn't pretty. If you've seen predators hunt down and take down and kill their prey, the object of their desire, and there's nothing pleasant about it in our eyes. Are we going to impose what we think or what we want to be so concerning morals, what's good and evil, what's right and wrong? Are we going to impose those on him? Or are we honest enough to say, maybe we don't understand what he regards as good and evil? Maybe we have been taught a very perverse, very incorrect system of what others believe, what man in his own limited, very, very, very limited, very subjective, very small, very myopic imagination, the imagination that was said to be evil continually. Are we going to subject him, the great sovereign creator and sustainer of this entire creation and all lives and all forms of lives that creep, that swim, that fly, that think, that love, that create symphonies and grand art and opulence and magnificent buildings? He is higher beyond bounds, more than all of the creation. Are we going to think to impose whatever subjective views we have on morals and ethics onto him? Or are we going to apply ourselves? Are we going to apply our minds, our hearts, what strength we have, what effort we can muster into the understanding that he's given us in his scriptures through his prophets? That's the question. Are we happy with stewing in our own perverse, limited, small, little belief systems? If so, well, then I guess you can go on with all of your arguments and your debates and your shit talking and your pissing and moaning. Go right ahead. Let me know how that works out for you. But the one thing that I do know from what I've learned so far is he is just, he is good, and he is a person, and he is an individual, and thus he has the right and prerogative to do as he will, to do as he pleases, to do what he sees right in his eyes, his sovereign, unquestioningly sovereign eyes. He has the right to transport one to heaven in fiery chariots. He has the right and prerogative to make another man who is righteous and obedient suffer for untold lengths of time. We don't even know how long Job or other righteous men or women suffered for in some cases, how long and to what extent their suffering was from, but he has the right and prerogative to do that, to give pleasure and opulence to one if he should so choose, and to deprive another. That's his right. And who the hell are you? Who am I? We're creatures. We are his created creatures. But if we know he's just, we know he's good, and he is just and good. But his ways and his plans and his designs are far above us. Will the evil get justice? Well, will they? You see, we, those of us who regard ourselves as good, moral, conscientious, we regard ourselves as, let's say, disciples of Christ, let's say Christians even. All of the terms that anyone who believes themselves to be good, to be justified, and that happens to be the greater majority of all beings out there that are capable of conscious thought, tend to be the hero of their own story. They all think that they're good. The men at the top that are extraordinarily wicked, that do amazingly brutal things, that their hands are stained with the blood of millions, they regard themselves as the hero in their story. So are those of us who do regard ourselves as good, who can see that there are injustices in the world, there are people who exist that are escaping justice, are we going to do anything about that? Because if they have the power to achieve the vast empires that they have achieved through their machinations, their scumbaggery, their animalistic behavior, or maybe just their nature. If they have the ability to do all of that through just the designs of man, and to be completely honest with you, I think because Yahweh has willed them to be where they are in order to effect the kinds of change specifically in his people that he promised to effect. We can be angry and upset about injustice, or and really do nothing. It's just piss and moan about it and wonder, where's God? Or those of us that have the ability to do something about it can do something about it. We also can petition him. And he listens to the prayers of the righteous. Who are the righteous? Those who long and strive after living and walking before him based on his word, his desire, his will, the instructions that he's given us. Those who believe him. Those who believe him and act based on those beliefs. Those are the righteous. What's the answer? What's to become of the wicked and the good if salvation isn't what we want it to be? Well, whether we have the answer right now or not, we're certainly not going to find any sort of clarification if we keep using the tools that have been provided to us by the same people who are brutally ruling over us. I can tell you that the answers aren't there. So in some cases, we're going to have to exercise some patience and wait. And we're going to have to exercise a lot of dedication and commitment in finding out. And we're going to have to exercise a lot of faith and trust, not in a system of belief, not in the 4 spiritual laws, not in the tract from Corner Baptist Church, but in real trust and real faith in the real person of the real Aliyim God of the Bible, Yahweh. And some things for right now may have to go without an answer. I lost track of how many things that I had questions about. Sometimes just serious intellectual inquiries that were very troubling. Some things concerning the terrible state of my health for years now. But I haven't gotten answers yet. I may not. And that doesn't make my Aliyim or Ale, Yahweh, unrighteous. He can do what he sees best to do. And what he's done with me and in my life, and what he will do with the rest of it and my death is his prerogative. And he is just. And he's good. So there's a lot of things right now that we don't have answers for. But there are things that I believe that we can find the answers to. Things that are going to radically clarify what we have misunderstood for a very long time. And that's what maybe even my next few episodes they're going to be tackling. They're going to be looking at the creation specifically. They're going to be looking at man, Adam. They're going to be looking at the living creatures of creation. It's going to be looking at their relationship, their roles. I'm going to be looking at the things that men have been struggling and arguing over for a really long time. But I had to start out with talking about salvation and all of the baggage that we bring to the table concerning our desires, what we want salvation to be, what we want Christianity to be, what we want morals to be, how we so badly want to impress our own morals on other people that we will freely impress our morals upon Yahweh, God. So we're going to have to start by not doing that. Looking at the facts and seeing what we can determine from the facts. Can we remove ourselves from it and look at it objectively? Because I certainly can remove myself from the idea that I have that I am an Israelite based on the fact that I am mostly German and some Celts with a peppering of Anglo and Scandinavian in there, it would appear. I can remove myself entirely from even the idea that I am one of the children of Jacob. And I could look at it as though I were not. And I just want to know what the facts are. And we've all got to be willing to do that. You know, are we all willing to do that's the question. Are we willing to divorce ourselves from our emotions and our wants and our desires and our belief and find out what the truth is? Because we're not getting anywhere at the rate we're going. We're really not getting anywhere. If everything today, if the whole way everything was going, the way the world was headed and everything, if today that all stopped, and let's just say all of the people in Christian identity or identity, because again, every time I mention it, I have to clarify and say, I am not Christian identity. I just happen to believe that the evidence exists that at least the Germanics and the Gauls were Israelites, and quite possibly more than that. But there are also tribes dispersed within tribes, and we both happen to be white people. And there's a lot of complication to that, and I understand that. And I can divorce myself from that belief based on a certain amount of facts and evidence, but it is a belief. And the only way we're going to get further down the road is by detaching ourselves, looking at the facts, and coming to the most sound conclusions possible based on the facts, no matter how that affects us personally. And I know just what it's like to have yourself invested in a very personal way in something that is very serious. Like the fact that the people who are running things today have for a very long time had ethnic Germans at the top of their list of people to extinguish. That is a fact that is very difficult to divorce yourself from emotionally. But if you have to, in order to get to the truth, are you willing to do that? Because that's what it's going to take. We have to look at everything that we can in the Bible objectively. And that's the first thing we have to start with, in my opinion, is all of the baggage we've brought to the idea of salvation, all the baggage we've brought to the ideas that of Christianity, our love affair with the guy that they call the Apostle Paul. And don't think I've made a concrete decision. I haven't. But that's what some people maybe don't understand is I don't have to have a concrete decision in order to see things that sometimes don't add up, or in order to see things that really do add up, but they go against all of the common norms of the groups today. And there's one thing I know is if you're going to follow the truth, you're not going to fit in with any group or faction there is today. That's just a fact. And it shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone. You show Jesus said as much. No one should be looking to be liked if they're going to follow him and be his disciple and follow after the truth to its end, no matter what that means for you personally. So with that, I'm going to end this one because I wanted to do this just in one shot. And I'm going to pick it back up with our origins. We're going to look at origins. We're going to start back at Genesis. We're going to talk about the words. We're going to talk about words that we've assumed based on Masoretic rules and dictates. We're going to look at words that we haven't been looking at, that we should be looking at. We're going to be looking at words that we always thought were something else because of the context that they're in, and none of us are seeing what they really are or what they most likely are based on word studies. Word studies that assume that there is some sort of correctness in the tools that we currently have, or some kind of truth and logic in anything having to do with Masoretic manuscripts and the Bible as it's been handed down to us by our enemies. So, I hope everyone will join me for episode 8 coming up very soon. I do have that other book, Notes on American Archaeology, that I will begin releasing sections of very soon. But, in the meantime, I will be thoroughly dealing with the subject that not just Dominic McCausland, but is becoming more and more and more and more prevalent in white nationalist circles and just in the minds of more people than probably it's ever been in before that I know of. Anyways. So, that's it for me. Until next time, I wish you all very well. And I know we're all looking at a really unsure future. But it's not for nothing. It's not for nothing. And goodness has got to come out of it in the end. Nihilism doesn't even make sense. I think nihilism is just the point that you get to where you can't cope with how difficult things are, so you just stop feeling or caring because it's too difficult anymore. So I hope all of you can keep faith in the days to come and keep trust in your God, our God, the God of the Scriptures, the real God. And I will talk to you again soon. Take care.